Deep in the Fezzan of modern-day Libya, far from rivers and coastlines, a kingdom once rose beneath the open Sahara sky. At its heart stood Garama, sustained by underground water, guarded by desert warriors, and connected to Rome through trade and conflict. The Garamantes built cities where others saw only sand, and carved lifelines beneath the earth itself. Before we begin the video, make sure to like, subscribe for more in-depth history, and share this journey with someone who loves forgotten civilizations. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Beneath the desert sun, the hidden kingdom of the Sahara. Under the vast sky of southwestern Libya, where the horizon seems to dissolve into heat and light, the Sahara does not immediately suggest the presence of cities, rulers, or kingdoms. It feels endless. Wind moves across dunes that rise and fall like frozen waves. Gravel plains shimmer beneath a pale sun. The air carries a silence so complete it almost hums. For centuries, outsiders believed that nothing lasting could grow here, that no civilization could anchor itself in such a place. And yet, beneath this desert sun, a kingdom once flourished. In the region known as the Fezzan, the land folds into a long depression called Wadi al-Ajal. At first glance, it appears as a fragile ribbon of green cutting through rock and sand. Date palms cluster tightly where underground water rises close to the surface. Fields, though modest today, still cling to life. But in antiquity, this valley was more than an oasis. It was a corridor of agriculture and settlement stretching across nearly 160 kilometres, capable of sustaining tens of thousands of people when carefully managed. At the centre of this valley once stood the city of Garama, the capital of the Garamantes. To understand how this was possible, we must step back thousands of years, long before Garama rose from the sand. The Sahara has not always been as harsh as it is today. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, during what scholars call the African humid period, monsoon patterns shifted northward. Rain fell across much of what is now desert. Lakes dotted the landscape. Grasslands stretched where dunes now dominate. Rock art across the central Sahara still depicts cattle, giraffes, and human communities living beside water. Over time, the climate shifted again. The rains retreated south. Lakes dried. Grasslands faded. The transformation was gradual but relentless. What had once been savanna hardened into aridity. Communities that depended on open pasture were forced to adapt or move. Some migrated toward the Nile Valley, others towards sub-Saharan regions. But in the Fezzan, certain groups chose to remain. These were pastoralists, people who herded cattle and later camels, who understood seasonal movement, who knew how to read the desert's subtle signals. They learned which valleys held groundwater. They memorized routes between wells. They observed the land not as empty space but as a living map. Over centuries, adaptation deepened. Instead of constant movement, some communities began to anchor themselves near reliable water sources. The Wadi al-Ajal offered something rare in the drying Sahara: access to fossil groundwater trapped deep beneath the surface. This water had accumulated thousands of years earlier during wetter climatic phases. Though invisible from above, it could be reached with effort and ingenuity. It was here that the earliest foundations of Garamantian society began to take shape. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the first millennium BCE, the Garamantes were emerging as a distinct cultural and political presence in the Fezzan. Burial mounds, hundreds of them, rise gently from the desert floor around the Wadi al-Ajal. Some are simple stone circles, others are elaborate tumuli, carefully constructed and aligned. These graves reveal a community that had developed social hierarchy, ritual practice, and a sense of continuity across generations. The city of Garama itself began as a fortified settlement. Its walls, built from mud brick and stone, enclosed administrative buildings, homes and storage areas. Excavations have revealed multi-room compounds, narrow streets, and evidence of organised planning. This was not a temporary encampment, it was a permanent urban centre in the middle of the Sahara. The survival of such a city depended on water, and here lies one of the most remarkable aspects of Garamantian ingenuity, the Foggara system. These were underground channels, gently sloping tunnels cut through rock and sediment, designed to tap into fossil aquifers and guide water by gravity toward fields and settlements. In some cases, these channels extended for several kilometres. Vertical shafts punctuated the surface at intervals, allowing workers to access and maintain the tunnels below. Constructing a Foggara required coordinated labour, planning and technical knowledge. It meant calculating gradients precisely enough that water would flow steadily without eroding the tunnel. It meant organising teams to excavate through hard desert substrates. It meant investing in infrastructure that would sustain not just a family, but an entire community. With reliable water came agriculture. The Garamantes cultivated barley, wheat, dates, and legumes. Date palms in particular were essential, providing food, shade, and materials. Beneath their canopy, smaller crops could grow in relative protection from the sun. This layered agricultural strategy maximised limited resources. The geography of the central Sahara shaped every aspect of Garamantian life. Sand seas, such as the Ubari Erg, lay to the west, creating natural barriers. Rocky plateaus to the north and east formed defensible high ground. The Wadi al-Ajal acted as a spine connecting smaller settlements and farms to the capital. Rather than isolating them, the desert positioned the Garamantes at a crossroads. Caravan routes ran north toward the Mediterranean coast and south toward sub-Saharan regions. Goods moved along these paths: gold, salt, ivory, semi-precious stones, and enslaved individuals captured or traded across vast distances. The Garamantes became intermediaries in this trans-Saharan exchange. Classical sources from the Mediterranean world mention them, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with suspicion. To the Romans, they were desert dwellers beyond the frontier, both traders and occasional adversaries. But the Garamantes were not merely reactive to external powers. Their kingdom developed its own internal complexity. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of craft specialisation, metalworking, pottery production, textile activity. Imported goods from Mediterranean regions indicate active participation in broader networks. Roman amphora fragments appear in Garamantian contexts, suggesting exchange rather than isolation. The desert environment demanded resilience. Summers brought extreme heat, with temperatures soaring above 45 degrees Celsius. Sandstorms could reshape the landscape overnight. Yet the Garamantes built in materials suited to their climate. Mud brick walls provided insulation. Thick construction moderated temperature swings between day and night. Streets were narrow, casting shade. Even burial practices reflect adaptation to environment and belief. The tumuli dotting the desert are visible markers of memory in an otherwise shifting landscape. Some contain grave goods, pottery, ornaments, occasionally imported items, signalling status differences within society. Others are simpler, perhaps belonging to common households. Together, they form a map of community across centuries. The first traces of Garamantian life are therefore not dramatic monuments towering above the desert. They are subtle: irrigation shafts, foundations, burial mounds, fragments of pottery eroding from the sand. Yet when assembled, these fragments reveal something extraordinary: a state-level society flourishing where outsiders saw only desolation. Modern technology has reshaped our understanding of this hidden kingdom. Satellite imagery has identified extensive networks of fogaras stretching far beyond what was visible from ground surveys. Entire fields once irrigated now lie abandoned, their outlines faint but detectable from above. These discoveries confirm that Garamantian agriculture was far more extensive than once assumed. The geography that once sustained them also contributed to their decline. Fossil groundwater, though abundant in antiquity, was not infinite. Over centuries, extraction likely exceeded natural replenishment. As aquifers lowered, fogaras would have required deeper excavation. Maintenance would have grown more difficult. Combined with broader climatic shifts and changing trade routes, environmental stress may have gradually undermined the kingdom's stability. But in their prime, the Garamantes transformed geography into opportunity. They did not conquer the Sahara by force. They negotiated with it. They studied its rhythms. They tunneled beneath it. They mapped it in memory and stone. When we stand today in the Fezzan and look across the Wadi al-Ajal, the landscape feels ancient and quiet, yet beneath our feet lie the remnants of a complex society that bridged Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds. Centuries before, later empires would attempt similar feats. The Garamantes remind us that deserts are not empty spaces between civilizations. They can be civilizations in their own right. Under the same relentless sun that once beat down upon their fields and city walls, the traces remain. Garama's ruins still rise slightly above the plain. The fogara shafts still puncture the earth like a dotted line of forgotten engineering. The tumuli still cast small shadows at dawn. Beneath the desert sun, a hidden kingdom once endured, shaped by geography, sustained by ingenuity, and remembered now through the patient work of archaeology. Before the kingdom, pastoral routes and early migration, long before walls rose at Garama, before underground water tunnels stitched life into the desert floor, before the Garamantes appeared in the writings of Mediterranean observers, there were herders moving slowly across a landscape that was still changing. Their story begins not with kings or cities, but with cattle, wells, and memory, with people who understood the land as a shifting companion rather than a fixed possession. In the region now called the Fezzan, deep in southwestern Libya, the desert holds older stories than stone walls. The cliffs of the Caucasus Mountains and surrounding plateaus preserve rock art that predates the Garamantes by millennia. Painted and engraved figures show cattle with curved horns, herders with staffs, scenes of milking, dancing, and hunting. These images belong to a time when the Sahara was not yet the hyper-arid expanse we know today, but a mosaic of grasslands, seasonal lakes, and open pasture. During the African humid period, roughly between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, monsoon systems pushed rainfall farther north. What is now desert-supported savanna ecosystems, communities moved with herds across wide grazing territories. Cattle were not merely livestock, they were wealth, identity, and survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that domesticated cattle reached parts of the central Sahara by the 6th millennium BCE. With them came a pastoral way of life built on mobility. Mobility was not random wandering, it followed seasonal rhythms. As rains shifted, so did grazing grounds. Knowledge passed orally, where water collected after storms, which valleys retained moisture longest, which rocky outcrops sheltered from wind. The landscape was read like a text. A dry riverbed, or wadi, was not simply empty. It hinted at hidden groundwater or a past flow that might return after heavy rains. As millennia passed, the climate began to dry. The transition was gradual but persistent. Lakes shrank, vegetation retreated, the monsoon boundary moved southward. Communities faced choices, move toward more reliable water sources, adapt their practices, or perish. Many migrated toward the Nile Valley or sub-Saharan regions. Others adjusted their strategies, reducing herd sizes, increasing mobility, and exploiting scattered oases. It is within this long arc of adaptation that the ancestors of the Garamantes likely emerged. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the central Sahara had become markedly drier, yet it was not empty. Oases such as those in the Fezzan region remained viable because of fossil groundwater stored deep beneath the surface. These aquifers had formed during earlier humid phases and were now isolated from regular replenishment. Reaching them required effort, but for communities with accumulated environmental knowledge, they represented stability in an otherwise unstable world. The early inhabitants of the Fezzan were pastoralists who gradually began to tether mobility to specific nodes, wells, springs, and shallow groundwater zones. Instead of long-distance seasonal migrations spanning hundreds of kilometres, movement patterns narrowed. Camps became semi-permanent. Over generations, the concept of territory shifted from fluid grazing grounds to more defined zones of influence. Archaeological surveys across the Fezzan have identified numerous small settlements dating to the early 1st millennium BCE. These sites often include stone enclosures, hearth remains, storage pits, and nearby burial mounds. They reflect communities that were no longer entirely transient. While herding remains central, there is increasing evidence of small-scale cultivation, particularly of hardy grains and date palms in areas where groundwater could be accessed. The shift from full nomadism to semi-sedentary life did not happen abruptly. It unfolded through experimentation. A group might remain near a reliable well for several seasons, planting crops while still moving herds to peripheral grazing areas. Over time, if yields proved consistent and water remained dependable, structures became more durable. Mud brick replaced temporary windbreaks. Storage facilities expanded. Social organisation adjusted accordingly. With partial settlement came new forms of social complexity. Mobility tends to distribute authority across kin networks and age hierarchies, but permanent settlement encourages more centralised coordination. Irrigation, even at a basic level, requires shared labour and agreed maintenance. Fields must be protected, harvests stored, surpluses allocated. Burial practices begin to signal status differences more clearly as lineage ties anchor to specific land. The burial mounds scattered across the Fezzan from this period provide important clues. Some are modest, containing simple grave goods. Others are larger and more elaborate, suggesting emerging elites or leading families. The very act of building a visible, durable tomb in a desert landscape implies a claim, a statement that we belong here. Pastoral identity did not disappear. Even as settlement increased, cattle and later camels remained vital. They connected communities across distances, facilitated trade, and preserved the cultural memory of mobility. Rock art from later phases depicts chariots and horse figures, indicating technological changes and broader regional connections. The introduction of the horse and light chariot, likely through contact with North African and Mediterranean networks, may have transformed desert movement. Classical writers later described the Garamantes using chariots in warfare or hunting, though such accounts must be interpreted cautiously. Still, the presence of horse remains, and iconography suggests that by the early 1st millennium BCE, the Fezzan was not isolated. It was integrated into expanding exchange systems. Trade likely began modestly. Exchange of salt, semi-precious stones, animal products. As communities became more stable, these networks intensified. Oases served as staging points for caravans moving between Mediterranean coastal settlements and sub-Saharan regions. The pastoral knowledge of routes and wells became an economic asset. Those who controlled key water sources gained leverage. Gradually, what had been a constellation of semi-sedentary pastoral communities coalesced into something more organised. Control over water, land, and trade demanded coordination beyond king groups. Leadership roles expanded from managing herds to negotiating alliances, resolving disputes, and overseeing irrigation works. Environmental pressure likely accelerated this process. As aridity increased, competition over reliable groundwater intensified. Communities that could organise labour to dig deeper wells or construct early underground channels gained advantage. Cooperation and hierarchy became survival strategies. The Wadi al-Ajal corridor offered particular promise. Its geological structure allowed relatively accessible fossil aquifers. Communities clustered along its length, creating a chain of settlements linked by shared agricultural zones. Over generations, this corridor would become the backbone of what later emerged as the Garamantian kingdom. Language and identity during this formative period remained difficult to reconstruct. The Garamantes are often associated with early Berber-speaking populations, though precise linguistic affiliations are debated. What is clearer is that cultural continuity links these early pastoral settlers with later urban Garamantes in burial forms, pottery styles, and settlement patterns. Pottery fragments from early Fezzan sites show both local traditions and influences from Mediterranean regions. This blending indicates gradual cultural exchange rather than sudden imposition. Migration into the Fezzan may have included groups from surrounding Saharan and North African zones, drawn by the relative stability of its groundwater resources. The shift from nomadic life to settlement is sometimes framed as a loss of freedom, but in the Sahara it represented strategic adaptation. Settlement did not eliminate movement, it redefined it. Herders still travelled with animals to distant grazing areas, but they returned to anchored communities. Mobility became seasonal rather than existential. Children born into these communities grew up knowing both the open horizon and the protective enclosure of walls. They learned to navigate dunes and to tend fields. Their world was no longer purely transient. Memory accumulated in place, in fields planted year after year, in wells deepened by collective effort, in tombs marking ancestors beneath stone cairns. Over time, leadership roles solidified. The need to coordinate irrigation, manage surplus, and defend trade routes likely encouraged the emergence of recognised authorities. Whether these leaders initially derived power from lineage, ritual authority, control of water, or martial skill remains debated, but by the early 1st millennium BCE, the foundations of centralised governance were taking shape. This transformation did not erase pastoral heritage, it layered new structures upon it. Even as settlement expanded, desert knowledge remained essential. Caravans crossing vast distances depended on guides familiar with seasonal winds and hidden wells. The identity of the people who would become the Garamantes was forged in this duality, rooted in land, yet shaped by movement. The first traces of Garamantian life are therefore inseparable from these pastoral roots. The kingdom that later impressed Roman observers was not an abrupt creation. It was the culmination of centuries of adaptation to climatic change, resource scarcity, and expanding exchange networks. In the Fezzan, the desert did not defeat its inhabitants. It refined them. It required flexibility, cooperation, and long-term planning. It demanded that communities read geology and climate as carefully as any text. Out of this demanding environment emerged a society that understood both the fragility and potential of oasis life. When the city of Garama eventually rose as a political centre, it rested upon this deep foundation of pastoral experience and gradual settlement. The walls and irrigation tunnels of the later kingdom were not contradictions of nomadic heritage, they were its evolution. Before there was a kingdom, there were herders watching the sky for rain that no longer came as it once did. There were families deciding to dig deeper rather than move farther. There were burial mounds marking permanence in a land defined by change. There were routes traced across sand that would one day become arteries of trade. Beneath the desert sun, the story of the Garamantes began not with power, but with adaptation, with pastoral roots sinking slowly into the sands of the Fezzan, preparing the ground for a kingdom that would astonish those who believed the Sahara could hold nothing enduring. Masters of the desert, survival in an unforgiving land. There is a particular silence in the central Sahara that feels almost deliberate. It is not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of endurance, a landscape stripped to its essential forms. Wind moves across the ergs in long, patient strokes. Sand shifts, reshapes, erases. Heat presses downward with a steady weight. In the Fezzan of southwestern Libya, survival has never been accidental. It has always been deliberate. The people who would become known as the Garamantes did not inherit a gentle homeland. By the time their society began to consolidate in the first millennium BCE, the Sahara had already undergone profound climatic transformation. The African humid period, when rainfall had once turned much of North Africa green, was long past. Lakes had receded or vanished. River systems that had once flowed seasonally were reduced to dry wadis. Vegetation retreated to isolated pockets where groundwater remained accessible. Climate change in the Sahara was not a sudden catastrophe, but a drawn-out rebalancing of atmospheric patterns. Monsoon systems shifted southward. Insolation cycles altered precipitation distribution. Over generations, communities witnessed springs weakening, grazing grounds thinning, and once reliable seasonal rains failing more frequently. For pastoral societies in the Fezzan, this gradual drying demanded adaptation at every level of life. Adaptation began with movement. Early pastoralists widened their routes, seeking remaining patches of vegetation, but movement alone could not offset the long-term aridification of the region. The Garamantes' ancestors responded not by abandoning the land, but by studying it more closely. They learned to interpret subtle variations in topography. Slight depressions in the earth hinted at subsurface moisture. Changes in vegetation signalled hidden aquifers. The desert, though harsh, contained clues. By the early first millennium BCE, this accumulated environmental knowledge began to manifest in technological innovation. The most remarkable of these innovations was the development and expansion of underground irrigation channels known as fagaras. These were not surface canals easily visible from afar, but subterranean lifelines carved carefully into the earth. Workers dug vertical shafts down to reach water-bearing layers, and then connected these shafts with gently sloping horizontal tunnels that allowed groundwater to flow naturally toward fields and settlements. Constructing a fogara system required a deep understanding of geology. The slope had to be precise enough to sustain flow without causing collapse or erosion. The depth had to intercept the aquifer while maintaining structural stability. Maintenance demanded coordinated labour, as sand intrusion and structural weakening were constant threats. These tunnels often extended for kilometres, sometimes linking distant groundwater sources to agricultural plots and tea. The Wadi al-Ajal corridor. This underground ingenuity represented a turning point. It allowed the Garamantes to transform fossil groundwater, accumulated thousands of years earlier during wetter climatic phases, into a renewable seeming resource, though in reality it was finite. With reliable water supply, agriculture became more consistent. Barley, wheat, and dates flourished in carefully managed plots. Date palms provided shade that reduced evaporation and created microclimates beneath their canopy, allowing secondary crops to grow. Water management shaped social organisation. Irrigation required collective responsibility. Tunnels had to be cleared and reinforced. Flow distribution had to be regulated. Disputes over allocation could threaten community cohesion. It is likely that leadership structures strengthened in tandem with irrigation complexity. As oversight and coordination became central to survival, the unforgiving nature of the desert also shaped architecture. Mud brick walls in settlements such as Garama were built thick to moderate temperature extremes. During the day, the mass of the walls absorbed heat slowly. At night, they released it gradually, softening the dramatic thermal swings typical of desert climates. Narrow streets reduced direct sun exposure. Courtyards provided controlled light and airflow. Beyond irrigation and architecture, adaptation extended to mobility technologies. The introduction and eventual widespread use of the camel dramatically altered desert survival. While earlier phases of Saharan life relied heavily on cattle and perhaps horses, the camel's physiological resilience to arid conditions made it indispensable. It could travel longer distances without water, carry heavier loads, and navigate sandy terrain more effectively than other domesticated animals. The camel turned the Sahara from an obstacle into a navigable expanse. With camels, trans-Saharan trade intensified. Caravans carried salt from desert mines northward and transported gold, ivory, and other goods from sub-Saharan regions toward Mediterranean markets. The Garamantes' strategic position in the Fezzan placed them at a crossroads of these routes. Mastery of desert travel, knowing the sequence of wells, the seasonal patterns of wind, the dangers of certain ergs, became economic power. Yet survival was not only technological or economic, it was cultural. Desert living fosters particular social traits: resilience, memory, and interdependence. Oral traditions likely encoded environmental knowledge, which wells were reliable in drought years, which valleys offered emergency grazing, which stars guided night travel. Such knowledge was not abstract, it was life-saving. Sandstorms posed constant danger. When high winds swept across the ergs, visibility could drop to near zero. Dunes shifted unpredictably, burying paths and sometimes structures. The Garamantes' decision to rely on underground water channels rather than exposed canals was in part a response to such volatility. Subterranean systems were shielded from wind erosion and evaporation. Heat presented another challenge. Summer temperatures in the central Sahara regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Agricultural labour had to be timed carefully, often undertaken in early morning or late afternoon hours. Storage facilities were designed to protect grain from spoilage. Date palms were pruned and managed to optimise yield while minimising water stress. Adaptation also meant negotiating with neighbouring communities. In an environment where resources were scarce, conflict could erupt over wells or grazing land, yet cooperation was equally essential. Trade alliances, marriage networks, and negotiated boundaries helped reduce the risk of sustained warfare that could destabilise fragile irrigation systems. Classical Mediterranean sources, particularly Roman accounts, describe the Garamantes as formidable desert inhabitants capable of rapid movement and effective resistance. While such sources often framed them as exotic or peripheral, archaeological evidence suggests a society deeply attuned to environmental management. Their survival strategies were not primitive improvisations, but refined systems built on centuries of observation and adjustment. Over time, however, the very ingenuity that sustained the Garamantes may have sown seeds of strain. Fossil aquifers tapped by fogaras were not replenished by contemporary rainfall. As extraction continued generation after generation, water tables likely declined. Extending tunnels deeper required greater labour investment. Maintenance demands increased. Agricultural productivity may have fluctuated as groundwater accessibility changed. Environmental stress was compounded by shifts in trade dynamics. as Mediterranean political landscapes evolved and sub-Saharan trade networks reconfigured, the Garamantes' intermediary role may have faced competition. Economic adaptation would have required flexibility similar to earlier climatic responses. Still, for centuries, the Garamantes thrived in conditions many would deem impossible. Their mastery of the desert lay not in conquering it, but in aligning with its constraints. They did not attempt to reshape the Sahara into a fertile plain. They learned to extract opportunity from its limits. The desert's harshness also shaped worldview. Living where survival depended on careful balance likely fostered a cultural respect for water and land. Burial practices, tumuli rising gently from gravel plains, suggest continuity and memory anchored to specific sites. In a landscape where wind could erase surface traces, the act of constructing durable tombs was a declaration of endurance. The Ubari Sand Sea to the west and rocky plateaus to the north formed natural defences. Geography offered both protection and isolation. The Garamantes' ability to navigate these terrains allowed them to control corridors others feared to cross. Their settlements were positioned with awareness of elevation, drainage, and access routes. Modern archaeological research, aided by satellite imagery, has revealed extensive networks of ancient fogaras radiating outward from the Wadi al-Ajal. These discoveries confirm that Garamantian agriculture was not marginal, but expansive. Fields once flourished in areas now barren. The desert we see today is the product of ongoing climatic evolution layered atop human extraction and abandonment. To call the Garamantes masters of the desert is not to romanticize hardship. It is to acknowledge a sophisticated interplay between environment and society. Climate change forced adaptation. Adaptation produced innovation. Innovation enabled complexity. The desert's unforgiving character demanded humility and ingenuity in equal measure. When we stand in the Fezzan today, wind brushing across gravel plains and dunes rising in quiet arcs, it is easy to perceive emptiness. But beneath the surface lie the channels they carved, the fields they tended, the paths their caravans traced. The Garamantes did not merely survive in an unforgiving land, they interpreted it, engineered within it, and for centuries flourished because they understood its limits better than those who dismissed it. Under the relentless sun, survival became art. Water flowed where none was visible. Crops grew where rain rarely fell. Trade moved across distances that seemed insurmountable. The Garamantes' legacy is written not in towering monuments, but in the subtle geometry of tunnels beneath sand, and in the quiet resilience of a people who chose to remain where others saw only desolation. The underground lifelines. Water beneath the sand. In the central Sahara, water does not announce itself. It does not flow in visible rivers or gather in dependable lakes. It hides. It sinks deep into layers of sand and stone, trapped thousands of years earlier when the climate was different, when rains fell more generously across North Africa. By the time the Garamantes emerged as a recognisable power in the Fezzan of southwestern Libya, that ancient water had become the most valuable substance in their world. Everything depended on it. To stand in the Wadi al-Ajal today is to see a narrow corridor of life pressed between expanses of aridity. Date palms still rise above small fields. Wells still puncture the earth. But in antiquity, this valley supported a far more extensive agricultural landscape, one made possible not by surface rivers, but by underground engineering on a remarkable scale. The Garamantes did not invent the idea of subterranean water channels from nothing. Similar systems, known in various regions as Karnats, Ketaras, or Fogaras, appear across parts of North Africa and the Near East. But in the Fezzan, these channels reached a density and scale that transformed an oasis society into a structured kingdom. Here, the underground lifelines were not marginal improvements. They were the foundation of political and economic power. The logic of the Foggara was elegant. Beneath the desert lay fossil aquifers, groundwater stored during wetter climatic periods thousands of years earlier. This water did not replenish through contemporary rainfall. It was ancient, finite, and invisible from the surface. To access it, one could dig a vertical well, but wells alone limited irrigation to areas immediately surrounding them. To expand cultivation across a wider area, a different strategy was required. The solution was to dig a gently sloping horizontal tunnel from a point where the aquifer lay relatively high, directing water by gravity toward lower, agricultural fields. Along the length of this tunnel, vertical shafts were excavated at regular intervals. These shafts allowed workers to remove debris, maintain the channel, and provide ventilation. From above, a Foggara appears as a dotted line of circular depressions stretching across the desert, each marking a shaft that connects to the hidden artery below. In the Fezzan, thousands of such shafts have been identified, particularly in and around the Wadi al-Ajal and near the ancient capital of Garama. Some tunnels extend for several kilometres. Their construction required careful calculation. The gradient had to be shallow enough to prevent erosion, yet sufficient to sustain continuous flow. Too steep, and the channel would collapse. Too flat, and water would stagnate. Excavation itself was labour-intensive and dangerous. Workers descended through narrow shafts, digging horizontally through sediment and rock. They relied on simple tools and physical coordination. Removing spoil required hauling material up through the shafts, bucket by bucket. Collapses were likely a constant risk, particularly in unconsolidated layers. The investment of labour suggests organised planning beyond household scale. The agricultural impact of these underground lifelines was transformative. Instead of isolated wells serving small clusters of date palms, entire fields could be irrigated consistently. Date palms formed the upper canopy of cultivated zones, providing shade that reduced evaporation. Beneath them grew cereals such as barley and wheat, along with legumes and vegetables. This layered agriculture maximised productivity while conserving moisture. The Foggara system also allowed water to be distributed across multiple plots through branching channels. Flow could be directed according to negotiated shares. In many oasis societies, water rights were carefully measured in time rather than volume. A household might receive irrigation flow for a certain number of hours per cycle. While direct documentary evidence for Garamantian water law is limited, the scale of their irrigation implies some system of allocation and oversight. Water management fostered social hierarchy. Those who controlled access to primary channels held leverage. Leadership likely emerged in part from the ability to coordinate excavation, maintenance, and distribution. Irrigation networks bound communities together in mutual dependence. If one segment collapsed or was neglected, downstream users suffered. Cooperation was not optional, it was survival. Archaeological surveys indicate that the Garamantes expanded their Foggara system significantly during the height of their kingdom, roughly between the 5th century BCE and the early centuries CE. Satellite imagery has revealed networks extending far beyond what was visible from ground exploration alone. Some scholars estimate that hundreds of kilometres of tunnels once operated in the Fezzan. Such expansion implies population growth. Agriculture supported urbanisation. Garama itself evolved into a substantial settlement with fortifications, administrative structures and residential quarters. Surplus grain enabled trade. Dates could be dried and transported. Stable food supply allowed craft specialisation and political consolidation. Yet the Foggaras were not infinite solutions. They tapped fossil water, a resource accumulated in ancient climatic conditions. Unlike river-fed irrigation systems, they did not draw from renewable annual floods. Over generations, continued extraction would have lowered the water table. To maintain flow, tunnels needed to be extended farther toward aquifer recharge zones or dug deeper. Each extension required additional labour and risk. There is evidence that some Garamantian fogaras were indeed lengthened over time. Later phases of construction appear to chase receding groundwater levels. Eventually, however, certain channels were abandoned as water tables dropped below practical. Excavation depths. Sections of the irrigation network fell dry. Agricultural fields reverted to dust. The agricultural revolution enabled by the fogaras was therefore both brilliant and precarious. It turned the desert into a managed landscape, but it relied on a non-renewable foundation. In its prime, the system demonstrated extraordinary adaptation to environment. In its decline, it exposed the limits of ancient sustainability. Beyond agriculture, water infrastructure influenced settlement patterns. Villages aligned themselves along foggerer outlets. Storage facilities were positioned to receive harvests efficiently. Defensive walls often encompass key water distribution nodes. Control over irrigation translated into control over food production and by extension political authority. Roman accounts mention the Garamantes in context of both trade and conflict. While Mediterranean observers may not have fully understood the technical sophistication of the fogaras, they would have recognized the economic vitality of oasis centres sustained by them. Imported Roman amphorae found in Garamantian sites suggest exchange networks linking the Sahara to coastal North Africa. The underground lifelines also shaped worldview. Living atop a hidden water source likely imbued the landscape with layered meaning. The desert surface appeared barren, yet beneath it flowed sustenance. Vertical shafts punctuated the ground like portals between visible and invisible realms. Maintenance of these shafts required routine descent into darkness, reinforcing an intimate relationship with the subsurface world. Environmental adaptation extended beyond engineering. Crops were selected for drought tolerance. Date palms were pruned to optimize yield. Fields were arranged to minimize evaporation. Irrigation schedules were likely timed to cooler hours. Grain storage structures protected against both heat and pests. The Fogara network in the Fezzan stands among the most impressive examples of this ancient Saharan engineering. Unlike monumental architecture visible from afar, these tunnels expressed a quieter form of mastery, one rooted in patience and precision. Their success depended not on conquering the desert, but on understanding its geological memory. Modern archaeological techniques have transformed appreciation of this system. Aerial surveys reveal faint lines of collapsed shafts, tracing patterns across otherwise featureless terrain. Ground excavations confirm tunnel dimensions and construction methods. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials helps establish chronological phases of expansion. What emerges is a picture of a society that invested deeply in infrastructure. The Garamantes did not rely solely on trade or pastoral mobility. They built an agricultural base capable of supporting urban life in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The eventual decline of the Fogara system likely contributed to the weakening of Garamantian political power as groundwater levels fell and maintenance burdens increased. Agricultural yields would have fluctuated. Population may have declined or migrated. Trade networks shifted in late antiquity, reducing economic incentives to sustain costly irrigation works. Yet the legacy of these underground lifelines endures. Some fogaras continued in use into medieval periods, adapted by later communities. Even where dry, their shafts remain visible, dotting the desert as subtle testimony to ancient ingenuity. To walk across the Fezzan today is to traverse a landscape layered with invisible engineering. Beneath the sand lie channels carved by hands guided by necessity and knowledge. Each shaft marks a decision: to dig rather than retreat, to cooperate rather than scatter, to invest in permanence within a transient environment. The Garamante transformed fossil water into the backbone of a kingdom. They turned geology into agriculture, scarcity into surplus. Their irrigation tunnels did not defy the desert. They negotiated with it, drawing carefully from its hidden reserves. In the end, the underground lifelines were more than technical achievements. They were expressions of a worldview that refused to see the Sahara as empty or hostile beyond adaptation. Beneath the sand, the Garamantes found continuity. Through tunnels and shafts, they extended that continuity across generations. Water, hidden and ancient, sustained them. And in tracing the lines of their fogaras across the Fezzan, we glimpsed a quiet revolution that allowed a desert kingdom to rise where few believed it could endure. Garama, capital of the Sand Sea. In the heart of the central Sahara, far from the Mediterranean coast and separated from sub-Saharan forests by hundreds of kilometres of desert, a city once stood that defied expectation. Its walls were not marble, its streets not paved in stone like Rome or Carthage, yet in its own environment it was no less deliberate, no less organised, and no less ambitious. This was Garama, the capital of the Garamantes, rising from the sands of the Fezzan in what is now southwestern Libya. To call it the capital of the Sand Sea is not poetic exaggeration. The Sahara surrounding Garama was not empty, but immense, a sea of dunes, gravel plains, and rocky plateaus stretching beyond sight. In such a landscape, a permanent city required more than shelter. It required planning, coordination, and constant adaptation. Garama did not appear suddenly. It evolved gradually from earlier settlements that clustered along the Wadi al-Ajal. The valley itself formed a natural corridor, narrow but fertile when supplied with groundwater from the Fogara systems. Over generations, smaller agricultural villages coalesced into a centralized urban nucleus. By the first millennium BCE, Garama had become a political and administrative heartland. Archaeological excavations revealed that Garama was not an accidental sprawl, it was structured. Mud brick walls enclosed sections of the city, forming defensive perimeters. Within those boundaries, residential compounds were arranged along narrow passageways designed to reduce exposure to direct sunlight. Streets were intentionally constricted, creating shaded corridors that moderated temperature in the intense desert heat. The city's architecture reflects a deep understanding of environment. Mud brick, made from local clay, mixed with straw and dried in the sun, was the primary building material. In the Sahara, where timber is scarce and stone difficult to transport in large quantities, mud brick offered insulation against extreme temperature fluctuations. During the day, thick walls absorbed heat slowly. At night, they released it gradually, softening the desert's dramatic thermal swings. Houses often centered around internal courtyards. These courtyards provided ventilation and light while maintaining privacy. Rooms opened inward rather than outward, protecting families from sand-laden winds. Flat roofs, likely constructed with palm trunks and packed earth, could serve as sleeping areas during cooler nights. Garama's layout suggests zoning of functions. Certain areas contained larger, more elaborate compounds, possibly belonging to elite families or administrative authorities. Other sections appear more modest, indicating variation in social status. Storage facilities for grain and dates were essential components of the urban fabric, ensuring food security in a climate where harvest failure could be catastrophic. The city's location was strategic. Positioned within the Wadi al-Ajal, Garama controlled access to agricultural zones irrigated by fogaras. It also stood at a crossroads of caravan routes connecting Mediterranean North Africa with sub-Saharan regions. This dual function, agricultural hub and trade intermediary, gave Garama both sustenance and influence. Daily life in Garama revolved around water, agriculture, trade, and family networks. At dawn, agricultural workers would move toward irrigated fields, adjusting channels to direct flow to specific plots. Date palms required pruning and harvesting at precise times. Grain fields needed tending. Water distribution schedules demanded coordination. Within the city, artisans shaped pottery from local clays. Some vessels were utilitarian: storage jars, cooking pots, transport containers. Others may have been decorative or ritual in purpose. Evidence of metalworking, though limited compared to Mediterranean centres, suggests local production of tools and possibly ornaments. Markets likely functioned as spaces of exchange, though their exact locations remain debated. Caravans arriving from the north or south would have brought goods, perhaps Roman amphorae filled with wine or oil, Mediterranean ceramics, textiles, or metal objects. In return, the Garamantes could offer dates, salt, livestock products, and access to trans-Saharan trade networks. Classical Roman writers mention the Garamantes as both traders and formidable desert dwellers. Though such accounts were often coloured by distance and limited understanding, they confirm that Garama was not invisible to the broader ancient world. It existed within an interconnected landscape of exchange and occasional conflict. Religion and ritual were embedded within urban life. Burial grounds surrounding Garama contained tumuli and more complex tomb structures. The presence of grave goods suggests belief in continuity beyond death. The visibility of these burial mounds in the surrounding desert reinforced memory and lineage. Identity. Urban planning also included defensive considerations. While the desert offered natural barriers, competition over trade routes and resources necessitated protection. Fortified walls and controlled entry points indicate awareness of potential threats. Yet Garama was not purely militarized. Its prosperity depended more on management than conquest. Water infrastructure extended into the city itself. Channels carried Fogara water toward distribution points. Wells within Garama supplemented supply. Maintaining these systems required ongoing labour. Collapsed sections had to be cleared. Sediment build-up removed. The city's survival was inseparable from this hidden engineering. Population estimates for Garama vary, but at its height it may have supported several thousand inhabitants, significant for a Saharan settlement. Surrounding villages in the Wadi al-Ajal added to this demographic footprint. Together, they formed a network anchored by the capital. The rhythms of daily life were shaped by climate. Midday heat discouraged outdoor activity. Work schedules adapted accordingly. Social gatherings likely occurred in shaded courtyards or during cooler evening hours. Oral storytelling, transmission of environmental knowledge, and reinforcement of social norms would have unfolded within these intimate spaces. Children growing up in Garama inherited a dual identity: urban residents of a fortified capital and descendants of pastoral ancestors. Camel caravans remained visible symbols of mobility. Trade required desert navigation skills. The city did not sever its connection to the wider Sahara. It concentrated and managed it. Over centuries, Garama expanded and contracted in response to environmental and political shifts. As groundwater levels fluctuated, agricultural productivity varied. Trade networks evolved with changes in Mediterranean empires and sub-Saharan dynamics. Yet for generations, Garama endured, not as an anomaly, but as a testament to adaptation. Archaeological work in the region has revealed cemeteries, residential quarters, irrigation channels, and administrative structures. Pottery typologies help establish chronological sequences. Imported artifacts provide evidence of external contact. Together, these materials reconstruct an image of a city that balanced isolation with connectivity. Garama's significance lies not in monumental architecture, visible from miles away, but in the coherence of its planning. It was built for its environment. Its materials, layout, and infrastructure reflect pragmatic intelligence. In a desert often perceived as empty, Garama demonstrates that complexity can thrive where resources are scarce, if managed with precision. The decline of Garama likely unfolded gradually. As fossil aquifers were depleted and maintenance demands increased, sustaining large-scale irrigation became more difficult. Trade routes may have shifted, reducing economic vitality. By late antiquity, the prominence of the Garamantes diminished, yet the city did not vanish entirely. Layers of occupation persisted into early Islamic periods. Today, the ruins at Garama, near the site of ancient Garama, rise modestly above the desert floor. Mud brick walls crumble, yet their outlines remain visible. Scattered pottery shards testify to daily routines long ended. The surrounding Wadi al-Ajal still supports agriculture, though at reduced scale. Garama challenges assumptions about the Sahara. It was not a temporary encampment or a marginal oasis. It was a capital, administrative, agricultural, and commercial. Its planning reveals deliberate organisation. Its architecture reflects environmental mastery. Its daily life combined resilience with adaptability. In the sand sea of the Sahara, Garama stood as a fixed point, a place where routes converged, water flowed beneath the surface, and a desert people built a city that endured for centuries. Kings of the caravan routes. Long before medieval empires turned the Sahara into a vast commercial highway, before camel caravans carried gold north to Islamic caliphates and salt south to forest kingdoms, there were already routes etched into the desert, fragile lines of memory connecting wells, oases, and distant markets. In the first millennium, BCE, and the early centuries CE, those lines converged in the Fezzan of southwestern Libya. At their centre stood Garama, capital of the Garamantes, a kingdom that rose not beside a great river or coastal harbour, but at the crossroads of sand. To understand the Garamantes as kings of the caravan routes is to recognise that their power did not depend solely on agriculture or irrigation. It rested equally on movement, on the ability to control, protect, tax, and facilitate long-distance trade across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. The Sahara has always been both barrier and bridge. To those unfamiliar with its rhythms, it appears impassable, but to communities who learned its wells and seasonal patterns, it became navigable. The Garamantes inherited generations of desert knowledge from pastoral ancestors. They knew where fossil groundwater could be found. They knew which wadis retained moisture longest after rare rains. They memorized the distances between oases measured not in miles, but in days of travel. When the camel became widely integrated into Saharan life, likely by the early first millennium BCE, the dynamics of trade shifted dramatically. Camels could travel longer distances without water than horses or cattle. They could carry heavier loads and endure high temperatures. With them, the Sahara's interior opened more fully to sustained exchange. Garama's location in the Wadi al-Ajal placed it in a strategic corridor linking the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa. To the north lay coastal cities influenced or controlled at various times by Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and later Romans. To the south stretched regions rich in gold deposits, ivory and other resources sought in northern markets. The Garamantes did not produce all these goods themselves. Their strength lay in mediation. Salt was among the most critical commodities. In arid climates, salt deposits form naturally in certain basins. Salt was essential for preserving food and sustaining livestock. It was heavy and difficult to transport, yet indispensable. Caravans carrying salt blocks moved southward, exchanging them for gold dust, animal skins, and enslaved individuals captured through regional conflicts or raids. Gold, light, and portable travelled north. Though the exact southern sources during the early Garamantian period remain debated, it is clear that trans-Saharan exchange predated later medieval systems. Even modest quantities of gold could have significant economic impact in Mediterranean markets. The Garamantes, positioned between zones of production and consumption, profited from facilitating these exchanges. Archaeological evidence supports this intermediary role. Excavations at Garamantian sites have uncovered fragments of Roman amphorae, large ceramic vessels used to transport wine, oil, and other goods. Mediterranean ceramics, glass beads, and metal objects appear in the Fezzan record. These imports indicate sustained contact rather than occasional curiosity. Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder mention the Garamantes, though often from a distance and with limited precision. They describe desert expeditions reaching Garamantian territory and note interactions ranging from diplomacy to conflict. These accounts confirm that the kingdom was visible enough to register within Roman geographic imagination. But the Garamantes were not passive recipients of Mediterranean goods. They exercised agency. Control of caravan routes meant control of taxation. Caravans moving through the Wadi al-Ajal likely paid tribute or negotiated safe passage. As is an environment where knowledge of wells could determine survival, local authorities held leverage over outsiders. Trade required infrastructure beyond irrigation. Caravan staging areas would have existed near Garama and along subsidiary settlements. Storage facilities for goods awaiting onward transport were necessary. Animal enclosures accommodated camels and other livestock. Markets, whether permanent or periodic, facilitated exchange between traders of different regions. The social impact of trade was profound. Exposure to foreign goods and ideas influenced material culture. Imported ceramics may have inspired local imitations. Metal tools and ornaments expanded craft possibilities. Cultural exchange likely flowed in multiple directions, shaping identity in subtle ways. Yet trade was not purely peaceful. Classical sources sometimes portray the Garamantes as raiders, capturing people from neighbouring regions. Enslaved individuals formed part of the trans-Saharan exchange system. Labour demands for irrigation and agriculture may have increased incentives to acquire captives. The ethics of such systems were embedded within ancient economic realities. They reflect a world in which human lives were often commodified. Caravan travel itself was an exercise in endurance and coordination. Journeys across the Sahara could last weeks. Routes were plotted from oasis to oasis, each stage determined by water availability. Night travel reduced heat exposure. Stars served as navigational guides. Sandstorms could delay progress or erase tracks. Successful caravans depended on experienced guides familiar with shifting dunes and hidden wells. Garama's prominence as a caravan hub reinforced its political authority. Leaders who could guarantee safe passage attracted traders. Stability encouraged commerce. Conversely, internal instability would have discouraged exchange, reducing revenue and weakening influence. The Garamantes' relationship with Rome illustrates this dynamic balance. At times, Roman expeditions sought to assert dominance or gather intelligence in the Fezzan, yet the logistical challenges of sustained occupation in the Sahara limited imperial reach. Instead, relationships oscillated between confrontation and accommodation. Trade continued even amid political tension. Beyond gold and salt, other commodities circulated: ivory, ostrich feathers, animal skins, and possibly agricultural products moved along these routes. The Garamantes' agricultural base, sustained by fagaras, enabled them to support caravan traffic with food and water supplies. Without reliable provisioning, long-distance trade would have faltered. The economic integration of the Garamantes into wider networks did not erase their distinctiveness. Their kingdom remained rooted in Saharan ecology. Trade amplified their prosperity, but did not define them entirely. It functioned as an extension of environmental mastery. Over centuries, caravan networks expanded and shifted. Changes in Mediterranean political landscapes, including Roman administrative adjustments in North Africa, altered demand and supply patterns. Similarly, developments in sub-Saharan regions influenced southern trade flows. The Garamantes had to adapt continually to remain relevant intermediaries. There is evidence that trade intensity peaked during the early centuries CE. Imported artifacts become more numerous in Garamantian context during this period. Urban growth at Garama suggests economic vitality, yet reliance on trade also introduced vulnerability. If routes bypassed the Fezzan or alternative corridors gained prominence, Garamantian influence would diminish. Trade shaped cultural horizons. Merchants arriving from Mediterranean ports brought news of distant empires. Caravans returning from southern regions carried stories of forests and rivers unseen in the Sahara. Garama became not only a commercial hub, but an information crossroads. Daily life in the capital would have reflected this diversity. Foreign traders may have lodged temporarily within designated quarters. Markets displayed goods unfamiliar to local farmers. Language exchange likely occurred, though documentation is sparse. Such interactions enriched urban experience. The Garamantes' mastery of caravan routes was therefore both practical and symbolic. Practically, it secured revenue and resources. Symbolically, it positioned a desert kingdom within broader historical currents. They were not isolated oasis dwellers, they were connectors between worlds. Eventually, however, environmental strain and shifting trade dynamics contributed to decline. As fossil aquifers lowered and irrigation systems required greater maintenance, agricultural support for caravans may have weakened. Political fragmentation could have reduced route security. By late antiquity, the Garamantes' prominence faded from Mediterranean texts, yet their role as early architects of trans-Saharan exchange should not be underestimated. Long before later empires formalized desert trade networks, the Garamantes demonstrated that sustained commerce across the Sahara was possible with sufficient knowledge and organization. To envision them as kings of the caravan routes is not to imagine opulent courts in marble halls, but leaders seated within mud brick compounds, overseeing the flow of goods and negotiating passage across dunes. Their wealth lay in connectivity. Their authority rested on mastery of distance. In the vast silence of the Sahara, caravans once moved in measured lines, bells tied to camel harnesses marking rhythm against wind. They carried salt carved from desert basins, gold dust wrapped in leather pouches, amphorae filled with Mediterranean oil and wine. At the heart of these exchanges stood Garama, a capital whose power flowed not from rivers, but from roots. The Garamantes understood that the desert was not empty space between civilizations. It was a medium of exchange. By reading its geography and commanding its pathways, they transformed sand into commerce and distance into opportunity. Encounters with Rome. When Rome looked south from the Mediterranean coastline of North Africa, it did not see empty wilderness. It saw uncertainty. Beyond the cultivated provinces of Africa, Proconsularis and Tripolitania, stretched a landscape that did not conform easily to imperial administration. The desert did not have fixed borders. It did not host cities that could be besieged and annexed in conventional fashion. It shifted, it concealed, and somewhere beyond its dry plateaus and sand seas lived a people whom Roman writers called the Garamantes. At the heart of their territory lay Garama, capital of the Garamantian kingdom in the Fezzan of what is now southwestern Libya. To Roman administrators on the coast, this inland kingdom represented both opportunity and risk, a potential trade partner and a possible source of instability along the frontier. The Roman presence in North Africa intensified after the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE. Over time, Rome consolidated control over coastal territories, building roads, ports, and agricultural estates that supplied grain and olive oil to the wider empire. Cities such as Lepsis Magna and Sabratha flourished. From these urban centres, Roman authority extended inland, but only so far. South of the cultivated coastal strip, geography began to resist imperial logic. The semi-arid steppe gave way to true desert. Maintaining permanent garrisons far from reliable water sources posed logistical challenges. Roman frontier strategy in North Africa relied on a combination of fortified lines, the limes, and alliances with local groups. Beyond these controlled zones lay regions described as barbarian, not necessarily because of cultural inferiority, but because they existed outside Roman administrative reach. The Garamantes occupied precisely such a space. Classical authors including Pliny the Elder and Tacitus mention them in passing, often emphasizing their remoteness. Yet these references reveal that Rome was aware of their organized presence and economic significance. In 19 BCE, during the reign of Augustus, a Roman general named Lucius Cornelius Balbus undertook an expedition deep into the Sahara. Ancient sources claim that Balbus reached Garamantian territory and possibly even Garama itself. Whether these accounts are embellished or precise, they indicate that Rome was willing to project force beyond its immediate frontier when strategic considerations demanded it. The motivations behind such expeditions were complex. The Garamantes had been described as conducting the raids northward into territories under Roman influence. Control over caravan routes meant control over trade revenue, and competition for that control could spark conflict. Roman authorities may have sought to deter Garamantian incursions or to assert symbolic dominance over a distant kingdom. Yet Rome did not attempt sustained occupation of the Fezzan. The desert's logistical barriers made long-term military presence impractical. Instead, frontier politics evolved into a pattern of intermittent confrontation balanced by diplomacy and trade. Archaeological evidence suggests that contact between Rome and the Garamante was not exclusively hostile. Roman amphorae, ceramics, and other imported goods found at Garamantian sites point to ongoing exchange. Diplomatic relationships likely involved negotiated access to caravan routes and agreements regarding cross-border movement. Rome's frontier in North Africa was never a rigid line. It functioned as a zone of interaction. Fortified posts served as monitoring points rather than impermeable barriers. Local tribes and kingdoms beyond the formal limes were integrated into a broader system of client relationships and trade networks. The Garamantes fit into this fluid landscape as both outsiders and partners. Roman military architecture along the southern frontier demonstrates awareness of desert mobility. Forts were positioned near wells and along caravan routes. Patrols monitored movement but could not prevent all crossings. The desert favoured those who knew it intimately. Garamantian familiarity with wells and seasonal patterns gave them strategic advantage in their own terrain. Conflict, when it occurred, was likely limited in scale. Large Roman armies were ill-suited for deep desert campaigns without extensive supply lines. Instead, punitive expeditions or retaliatory raids may have characterized military encounters. Roman accounts often framed such operations as victories, reinforcing imperial prestige regardless of long-term outcomes. Diplomacy offered more sustainable solutions. Trade benefited both sides. Mediterranean markets desired gold, exotic animals, and other goods that flowed through trans-Saharan networks. The Garamantes, in turn, valued Roman products, wine, olive oil, fine ceramics, metal tools. Mutual economic interest encouraged negotiated coexistence. The cultural implications of contact were subtle, but, as key, significant. Imported goods influenced material culture in Garama. Roman decorative motifs may have inspired local adaptations. Conversely, Roman awareness of Saharan geography expanded through interaction with Garamantian guides and traders. Frontier politics also involved third parties. Other North African groups, some nomadic, others semi-sedentary, interacted with both Rome and the Garamantes. Alliances shifted. Rome sometimes supported one group to counterbalance another. The Garamantes navigated this complex web with caution, preserving autonomy while engaging in necessary diplomacy. The perception of the Garamantes within Roman literature often oscillated between curiosity and suspicion. They were described as distant and somewhat mysterious. The desert itself contributed to this aura. Unlike urban centres easily mapped and described, Garama lay beyond the routine experience of most Roman officials. Despite these perceptions, the Garamantes were not marginal. They represented an organised polity capable of coordinating irrigation, agriculture, and trade across challenging terrain. Rome's inability, or unwillingness, to fully annex the Fezzan underscores the limits of imperial expansion in extreme environments. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, trade connections appear to have intensified. Rome and North Africa reached peak economic productivity during this period. Increased movement of goods likely strengthened ties with inland intermediaries. Garama's continued occupation and expansion during these centuries suggests relative stability in relations. However, shifts in Roman political stability eventually reverberated outward. As the empire faced internal crises in the 3rd century CE and later transformations in late antiquity, frontier management changed. Reduced resources for distant campaigns may have lessened direct engagement with the Sahara. Trade patterns adjusted accordingly. For the Garamantes, interaction with Rome was never about subordination alone. It was about balance. They leveraged their control of caravan routes to negotiate from a position of strength. They engaged in trade without surrendering identity. They resisted when necessary and accommodated when beneficial. The desert itself remained a decisive factor. Rome's power was formidable along coastlines and fertile provinces, but in the sand sea south of the Limes, mobility and environmental knowledge prevailed. The Garamantes were masters of that domain. Over time, as fossil aquifers declined and trans-Saharan trade networks evolved, the Garamantes' prominence diminished. Yet during their height, their encounters with Rome illustrate a nuanced frontier dynamic, one in which empire met oasis kingdom not simply through conquest, but through negotiation, commerce, and cautious respect. To imagine a meeting between Roman envoys and Garamantian leaders is to picture two worlds intersecting, one grounded in Mediterranean urbanism and imperial administration, the other rooted in desert adaptation and caravan mastery. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived under different environmental constraints, yet their interests overlapped enough to sustain contact across centuries. Encounters with Rome did not erase the Garamantes' autonomy. Instead, they inserted a Saharan kingdom into the broader narrative of ancient geopolitics. In the shifting frontier politics of North Africa, Garama stood not as a peripheral footnote, but as a participant in a complex web of conflict and diplomacy shaped as much by sand and water as by ambition and empire. Warriors of the Wadi. Power in the Sahara was never measured by walls alone. It was measured by movement, by who could cross the desert and return, who could find water where others saw only glare and stone, who could strike and disappear into the horizon before pursuit could organise itself. The Garamantes, whose capital at Garama anchored the Wadi al-Ajal in the Fezzan of southwestern Libya, did not dominate their region through massive standing armies in the Mediterranean sense. Their military strength emerged from intimate environmental knowledge, mobility, and tactical flexibility. They were warriors shaped by wadis, gravel plains, and sand seas. Classical sources, though limited and sometimes exaggerated, describe the Garamantes as formidable desert fighters. Roman writers referred to their swift movement and noted the use of light chariots. These accounts must be approached carefully. They were written from outside perspectives, often emphasizing exotic elements. Yet, archaeological and iconographic evidence from Saharan rock art confirms that chariots were known in the region during the first millennium BCE. Rock engravings in the Akarkas Mountains and other Saharan plateaus depict horse-drawn chariots, sometimes in hunting or martial contexts. Whether the Garamantes themselves used chariots extensively in warfare remains debated, but it is plausible that elite or ceremonial units employed them. In open gravel plains or firm desert crusts, light chariots could move rapidly, offering both symbolic prestige and tactical mobility. However, the desert environment limited heavy warfare. Large infantry formations typical of Mediterranean battles would have struggled in extreme heat and water scarcity. Campaigns had to account for logistics above all else. Water sources determined routes and strategy. An army unable to secure wells would collapse before engaging an enemy. The Garamantes' advantage lay precisely in this knowledge. Their pastoral heritage meant they understood the distribution of wells, the reliability of seasonal waterholes, and the subtle terrain features that concealed or revealed movement. A force familiar with the land could stage ambushes near choke points, narrow passes between rocky outcrops, approaches to wadis, or known caravan trails. Desert warfare emphasised speed and surprise. Small mobile units could raid rival settlements or intercept caravans. Camels, once fully integrated into Saharan life, enhanced this mobility, while earlier phases of Garamantian culture likely relied more heavily on horses and cattle. The camel's endurance in arid conditions made it invaluable for both trade and conflict. Roman accounts mention Garamantian raids into territories near the southern edges of imperial provinces. Such raids may have targeted livestock, captives, or control points along trade routes. The aim was rarely territorial conquest in the Mediterranean sense. It was influence and leverage. The Wadi al-Ajal itself provided defensive advantages. As a corridor flanked by higher terrain and surrounded by expanses of desert, it could be monitored and controlled. Approaches to Garama would have been visible across open ground. Fortified walls within the capital added another layer of defence, but geography remained the primary shield. Weapons used by the Garamantes likely included spears, short swords, and bows. Archaeological finds of metal objects are limited, but suggest access to iron and other materials through trade networks. Leather shields and protective garments may have been used, though preservation conditions rarely allow such organic materials to survive archaeologically. Military organisation in a Saharan kingdom would have differed from that of large empires. Instead of permanent regiments, forces may have been mobilised through clan or tribal networks. Leaders could call upon allied groups when conflict threatened shared water sources or trade interests. Loyalty was reinforced by kinship ties and mutual dependence on irrigation systems. The control of water infrastructure itself had military implications. Destroying or sabotaging Fagara channels would have been devastating. Therefore, protection of irrigation systems was a strategic priority. Settlements were positioned to guard key shafts and outlets. Surveillance of surrounding terrain minimised the risk of surprise attacks. Regional dominance for the Garamantes meant ensuring that caravans preferred routes passing through their territory rather than bypassing it. This required both security and deterrence. A reputation for swift retaliation discouraged rivals from interfering with trade under Garamantian oversight. Chariots, if indeed used operationally, would have functioned best in specific contexts: rapid reconnaissance, pursuit across firm ground, or ceremonial display reinforcing elite status. Over time, camels likely replaced horses as the dominant transport in warfare as well as commerce, due to their superior endurance. The psychological dimension of desert warfare should not be underestimated. The Sahara's vastness amplifies uncertainty. A small mobile force familiar with hidden wells could outmaneuver a larger, less experienced adversary. Dust clouds on the horizon might signal approaching riders or simply wind. Night travel allowed repositioning without detection. Encounters with Rome provide glimpses of Garamantian military capacity. The Roman expedition led by Lucius Cornelius Balbus in 19 BCE reportedly penetrated Garamantian territory. Whether this involved direct siege of Garama or confrontation in peripheral zones is unclear. What is evident is that Rome did not establish permanent garrisons in the Fezzan, suggesting that sustained control was neither practical nor cost-effective. Frontier politics favoured equilibrium. The Garamantes could resist deep incursions by exploiting supply line vulnerabilities. Roman forces, dependent on extended logistics from coastal bases, faced challenges maintaining desert campaigns. This balance allowed the Garamantes to retain autonomy, even while engaging in trade and occasional diplomacy. Internal security also required vigilance. As a hub of trans-Saharan exchange, Garama attracted traders, migrants, and potentially rival factions. Maintaining order within the city and its surrounding agricultural zones demanded coordinated authority. Leaders who commanded respect in both civil and martial contexts were essential. Burial mounds in the region sometimes contain weapons or objects associated with status, hinting at warrior identities within society. Such burials reinforce the idea that martial capability formed part of elite identity. Yet warfare in the Sahara was likely episodic rather than constant. Environmental constraints discouraged prolonged campaigns. The concept of dominance in the Garamantian context was fluid. It did not involve annexing distant territories, but ensuring that neighbouring groups acknowledged their control of key resources and routes. Influence radiated outward from the Wadi al-Ajal along caravan paths. Climate variability could also influence conflict. Periods of drought intensified competition over water and pasture. In such times, raids may have increased as communities sought to secure survival. Conversely, more stable conditions may have reduced incentives for aggression. Over centuries, as fossil aquifers declined and trade networks evolved, the Garamantes' regional dominance gradually weakened. Reduced agricultural output, limited capacity to provision large forces, shifting caravan routes, diminished strategic leverage. By late antiquity, references to the Garamantes in Roman texts become less frequent, yet during their height they embodied a form of military power uniquely adapted to environment. They were not legionaries in disciplined ranks, nor heavy cavalry charging across fertile plains. They were desert tacticians. Their battlefield was the horizon itself. To imagine Garamantian warriors is to picture riders moving along the edge of a wadi at dawn, scanning for dust trails that might signal approaching caravans. It is to imagine chariots skimming across firm desert crust, horses' hooves striking sparks from stone. It is to envision small groups gathering near a well, aware that control of that water could determine the outcome of a confrontation. The desert forged a particular kind of warfare, one defined by restraint, precision, and deep environmental literacy. The Garamantes mastered that art. Their dominance was not loud or sprawling, but persistent. In a landscape where miscalculation meant death by thirst, they calculated carefully. Warriors of the Wadi did not rely on monumental fortresses or massive armies. They relied on knowledge, mobility, and the ability to read sand and sky. Through these means, they secured their kingdom's place in the shifting political landscape of ancient North Africa, maintaining autonomy in the shadow of Rome and asserting control across the silent expanse of the Sahara. Beliefs beneath the open sky. In the central Sahara, beneath the vast sky of the Fezzan in southwestern Libya, religion did not rise in towering stone temples. It did not carve its theology into monumental inscriptions or leave behind written hymns. Instead, belief unfolded beneath open horizons, within burial mounds of stone, beside irrigation shafts that carried unseen water through darkness. At the heart of Garamantian life, centered in and around Garama, spirituality was woven into daily survival. In a land where water lay hidden beneath sand, and death could arrive with heat or thirst, the sacred was not distant, it was immediate. The Garamantes left no deciphered religious texts. Their beliefs must be reconstructed from archaeology. Graves, rock art, settlement patterns, and objects placed with care beside the dead. These fragments suggest a worldview shaped by environment, one in which ancestors, land, and survival were intimately linked. The most visible spirituals, markers in the Garamantian landscape, are the tumuli. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of burial mounds dot the gravel plains and ridges of the Wadi al-Ajal and surrounding regions. Some are simple cairns, circular piles of stone marking a single grave. Others are more elaborate, with carefully constructed chambers beneath stone coverings. Their variation in size and complexity indicates social distinction, but their ubiquity reveals something deeper, a sustained commitment to remembering the dead. In the desert, memory is fragile. Wind reshapes dunes. Footprints vanish overnight, yet burial mounds endure. They anchor identity to place. To build a tumulus is to claim continuity, to assert that a family or lineage belongs to that landscape across generations. Excavations of Garamantian graves reveal diverse burial practices. Some individuals were interred in simple pits. Others rested within stone-lined chambers. Grave goods sometimes accompany the deceased. Pottery vessels, beads, metal ornaments, occasionally imported items. These offerings suggest belief in an afterlife, or at least in a continued relationship between living and dead. The orientation of graves and the placement of bodies vary, indicating evolving ritual traditions over time. Certain cemeteries cluster near settlements, reinforcing the connection between community and ancestors. Others stand isolated, marking roots or boundaries, perhaps serving as territorial statements as well as spiritual ones. Ancestor veneration likely formed a central pillar of Garamantian spirituality. In Oasis, societies dependent on inherited irrigation rights and land claims, lineage memory was not symbolic alone, it had practical implications. Remembering ancestors reinforced social hierarchy and legitimacy. Leaders could trace authority through family lines anchored in visible burial monuments. Water itself carried spiritual resonance. The Foggara systems that sustained agriculture tapped ancient groundwater. Invisible, silent, essential. To descend into a vertical shaft was to enter darkness and coolness beneath scorching sun. Such spaces may have held symbolic meaning beyond their technical function. The unseen flow of water beneath the sand could easily be interpreted as a hidden lifeline granted by forces beyond immediate perception. Rock art in the Akarkas Mountains and other Saharan sites predates the Garamantes but influenced the cultural landscape they inherited. Engravings depict cattle, human figures, chariots, and sometimes scenes interpreted as ritual or dance. Though direct continuity cannot be assumed without caution, these images testify to a long-standing tradition of symbolic expression in the region. The open sky itself may have shaped cosmological thought. In the Sahara, night reveals stars with extraordinary clarity. Navigation across desert relied on celestial observation. The movement of constellations across seasons marked time. It is plausible that Garamantian belief systems incorporated celestial elements, tying survival and travel to patterns above. Unlike Mediterranean religions with pantheons recorded in literature, Garamantian deities remain largely unnamed in surviving evidence. However, interaction with neighbouring cultures, including Roman North Africa, likely introduced new religious concepts. Imported objects sometimes carry decorative motifs associated with Mediterranean iconography. Whether these were adopted symbolically or appreciated purely as trade goods is uncertain. Religious practice in Garama itself likely occurred within domestic or communal spaces rather than grand temples. Small altars or designated ritual areas may have existed within houses or near irrigation points. The absence of large temple complexes does not indicate absence of faith. Rather, it reflects environmental pragmatism and perhaps decentralized spiritual authority. Spiritual specialists may have existed, individuals responsible for guiding, funerary rites, mediating disputes through ritual, or interpreting omens. In a society where water management and climate awareness were crucial, ritual and environmental knowledge could overlap. Appeasing forces associated with rainfall or groundwater would align naturally with agricultural survival. Death in the Sahara carried immediate practical realities. Rapid burial prevented exposure to heat and scavengers, yet the care invested in constructing tumuli and placing grave goods demonstrates reverence beyond mere necessity. Some graves show evidence of repeated visitation, suggesting ongoing rituals of remembrance. Cultural identity intertwined with spiritual practice. Burial styles distinct to the Garamantes differentiated them from neighbouring groups. Pottery placed in graves often reflects local craftsmanship rather than imported luxury, emphasising continuity over imitation. Contact with Rome introduced potential religious intersections. Roman North Africa hosted a mixture of traditional Roman deities, local Berber gods, and eventually early Christian communities. While direct evidence of Christianity in Garama during its peak remains limited, later periods of North African history saw widespread religious transformation. It is possible that Garamantian spiritual traditions adapted or blended with incoming beliefs over time. Yet at their core, Garamantian beliefs appear grounded in land and lineage. The desert demanded humility. Storms could erase fields. Wells could dry. Spiritual frameworks likely addressed uncertainty, seeking protection, continuity, and balance. Ritual feasting may have accompanied funerary ceremonies. Shared meals reinforce community bonds and honour the deceased. Music, dance, and oral recitation could have played roles in commemorations, though such practices leave little archaeological trace. Spiritual symbolism may also be embedded in settlement orientation. Positioning of cemeteries relative to prevailing winds, water, sources or sunrise points could reflect cosmological associations. Detailed archaeological mapping continues to explore these patterns. As fossil aquifers declined and the political structure of the Garamantes weakened, spiritual traditions likely adapted. Abandoned irrigation channels and shrinking agricultural zones would have altered perceptions of divine favour or environmental balance. Ritual responses to drought or decline may have intensified. The endurance of burial mounds across centuries testifies to lasting reverence for ancestors. Even after Garama's prominence faded, later communities reused or respected these tumuli, acknowledging continuity with the past. Beliefs beneath the open sky were not codified in surviving texts, yet they shaped daily behaviour. They influenced how land was claimed, how leaders justified authority, how families remembered their dead. They provided meaning in a landscape where survival was never guaranteed. To walk today among the tumuli of the Fezzan at sunset is to sense the quiet persistence of that worldview. The sky stretches unbroken. Wind moves across gravel plains. Each mound casts a small shadow, a reminder that beneath the sand lie individuals once embedded in families, communities, and spiritual traditions. The Garamantes did not build towering sanctuaries, but they built memory into the land itself. Their religion was not separated from survival, it was entwined with it. Water flowing unseen beneath sand, stars guiding caravans at night, ancestors resting beneath stone. These were elements of a spirituality shaped by openness and endurance. Under the vast Saharan sky, belief was not confined by walls. It was carried in ritual, in burial, in the careful tending of irrigation channels. It lived in continuity, from parent to child, from generation to generation, sustained as quietly and persistently as the ancient groundwater that once nourished their fields. Decline in the dunes. No kingdom in the Sahara collapses in a single dramatic moment. There are no sudden burning capitals swallowed overnight by sand. Decline in the desert is quieter. It is measured in wells that yield less water each season, in irrigation channels that require deeper excavation, in caravans that begin to choose alternate routes. For the Garamantes, whose capital at Garama once anchored the Wadi al-Ajal in the Fezzan of southwestern Libya, decline unfolded slowly across generations. It was not a single invasion or sudden catastrophe that ended their prominence. It was strain. Environmental, economic, and political pressures layered gradually until the structure that had sustained them began to weaken. At the foundation of Garamantian prosperity lay fossil groundwater. The Sahara systems that transformed the desert into productive agricultural land drew from aquifers formed thousands of years earlier during wetter climatic phases. These aquifers were not replenished by contemporary rainfall. Each season of irrigation represented extraction from a finite reserve. During the height of the Garamantian kingdom, this reserve appeared abundant. Fields flourished. Date palms cast shade over layered crops. Surplus supported urban growth and caravan provisioning. But groundwater decline is often invisible at first. Water tables drop incrementally. Wells require extension. Flow weakens. Maintenance demands increase. Archaeological evidence suggests that over time, some Sahara tunnels were lengthened to chase receding aquifers. Vertical shafts were deepened. Labour investment grew heavier. Such adaptations demonstrate resilience, but they also signal strain. When water must be pursued farther and deeper, sustainability enters uncertain territory. As aquifers declined, agricultural yields would have fluctuated. Reduced crop output directly impacted food security and the capacity to support trade caravans. In an oasis economy, even modest decreases could ripple outward, affecting population stability, tax revenue, and political authority. Environmental change was not limited to groundwater depletion. Broader climatic variability in late antiquity may have altered regional precipitation patterns. Even minor shifts in temperature and rainfall can compound stress in arid systems. Drought cycles likely intensified competition over water allocation within communities. Trade networks also evolved. During the early centuries, CE, trans-Saharan exchange linked the Garamantes to Mediterranean markets under Roman influence. Roman North Africa reached economic peaks during this period, but as the Roman Empire faced internal crises in the 3rd century CE and later transformations in the 4th and 5th centuries, demand patterns shifted. Political instability along the Mediterranean coast disrupted established exchange routes. Declining Roman administrative capacity may have reduced the volume of goods flowing through North Africa. At the same time, emerging trade corridors elsewhere in the Sahara could have bypassed the Fezzan, diminishing Garamantian leverage as intermediaries. The strength of the Garamantes lay in their ability to control caravan routes. If caravans found safer or more efficient alternatives, that advantage eroded. Economic vitality was inseparable from geographic centrality. Once routes shifted, political authority weakened. Internal social pressures likely accompanied these external changes. As agricultural surplus shrank, competition among elite families for control of remaining resources may have intensified. Disputes over irrigation rights could strain cohesion. The social hierarchy that once coordinated large-scale labour projects might fragment under scarcity. Urban contraction at Garama appears gradual rather than abrupt. Archaeological layers indicate continued occupation into late antiquity, though with signs of reduced density and maintenance. Structures fell into disrepair. Irrigation networks were abandoned section by section. Fields once carefully tended reverted to dust. Decline in the dunes was not a dramatic disappearance, but a thinning of population, of infrastructure, of political centralisation. Smaller settlements may have persisted even as centralised authority waned. People did not vanish. They adapted once again, perhaps returning to more mobile pastoral strategies as irrigation became unreliable. External political forces may also have contributed. The spread of new powers and religious movements across North Africa in late antiquity reshaped regional dynamics, while direct evidence of conquest in the Fezzan during this period remains limited. Shifting alliances and emerging authorities elsewhere influenced trade and communication patterns. As the Roman Empire transformed and later fragmented in the West, frontier politics changed. Without stable Roman demand and administrative support along the coast, economic incentives sustaining long-distance caravan exchange may have declined. Reduced traffic meant reduced taxation and protection revenue for Garamantian leaders. The decline of centralised power does not necessarily equate to cultural extinction. Elements of Garamantian society likely persisted within subsequent Saharan communities. Irrigation knowledge, burial traditions, and social structures adapted rather than disappeared entirely. Archaeological surveys show that some fogaras continued in limited use into medieval periods, though at reduced scale. Later oasis settlements inherited aspects of Garamantian infrastructure. The landscape retained memory of earlier engineering even as political identity shifted. Environmental strain and economic transition combined to erode the foundation of the kingdom. When water is the lifeblood of agriculture, and agriculture sustains trade, any disruption reverberates across society. The Garamantes' mastery of their environment had always been delicate. Once aquifers declined beyond recovery and trade advantages diminished, the balance tipped. The desert itself continued its slow transformation. Dunes advanced. Gravel plains expanded where fields once lay. Wind erased surface traces of abandoned structures. Without constant maintenance, mud brick walls collapsed back into earth. Yet decline in the dunes was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was the inevitable consequence of finite resources meeting long-term extraction and shifting global systems. The Garamantes had adapted brilliantly to environmental constraints for centuries. Their irrigation revolution allowed a desert kingdom to flourish against expectation. But no adaptation is immune to cumulative stress. In the absence of dramatic conquest narratives, their fading may seem less compelling than the fall of great empires. There were no marble capitals sacked in flames. Instead, there were quieter endings. A fogara shaft left unmaintained, a caravan route abandoned, a family choosing to migrate rather than remain. The tumuli surrounding the Wadi al-Ajal remained. Ancestors rested beneath stone, even as descendants dispersed or reorganized. Cultural memory endured in practices and place names long after political structures dissolved. Garama itself did not vanish entirely. Later occupations left layers atop earlier ones, but the centralized power that once coordinated irrigation and trade ceased to dominate the region as it had during its height. Decline in the dunes illustrates the fragility of desert kingdoms. Prosperity depends on equilibrium between extraction and renewal, between trade and stability, between leadership and cooperation. When that equilibrium falters, recovery is difficult in environments offering little margin for error. The story of the Garamantes' weakening does not diminish their achievement. It underscores it. For centuries, they sustained urban life, agriculture, and regional dominance in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Their eventual contraction reflects environmental realities rather than sudden incompetence. Today, the ruins near Garama stand as muted testimony. Abandoned Foggara shafts trace lines across barren ground. Collapsed walls outline former homes. The desert has reclaimed much, but not all. Decline in the dunes was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual surrender to shifting conditions. It was the final chapter in a long narrative of adaptation, one that began with pastoral roots, rose through irrigation and trade, and slowly returned to smaller scales of survival. In the end, the Garamantes remind us that desert civilizations do not disappear in silence. They leave patterns beneath sand, networks of tunnels, mounds of stone, and lessons about resilience and limits. Their kingdom faded, but their imprint on the Sahara endures, subtle, enduring, and shaped by the same winds that once carried caravans across their domain. The lost civilization. Rediscovered. For centuries, the Garamantes existed at the edge of historical memory. Classical writers mentioned them briefly, often vaguely. The desert concealed their cities beneath drifting sand and eroded mud brick. Travellers crossing the Fezzan saw ruins, burial mounds, and scattered shafts, but without context, these remains seemed isolated, fragments without a coherent narrative. It was not until modern archaeology turned sustained attention to the Fezzan of southwestern Libya that the scale of Garamantean civilization began to emerge. And even then, understanding unfolded gradually, through excavation trenches, pottery shards, aerial surveys, and eventually satellite imagery revealing patterns invisible from the ground. At the centre of this rediscovery lay the ruins near Garama, identified with ancient Garama. Early explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries noted substantial remains in the Wadi al-Ajal corridor, mud brick walls, cemetery tumuli, and traces of irrigation channels suggested organised settlement. Yet for decades, the Garamantes were dismissed as marginal desert tribes mentioned only fleetingly in Roman texts. Systematic archaeological work in the mid to late 20th century began to change that perception. Excavations uncovered structured residential compounds, defensive walls, storage facilities, and craft evidence. Pottery sequences allowed researchers to establish chronological phases of occupation stretching from the early 1st millennium BCE through late antiquity. Imported Mediterranean ceramics confirmed sustained trade connections. The true transformation in understanding, however, came with advances in remote sensing. Satellite imagery of the Sahara revealed networks that could not be fully appreciated from ground level. Across the Wadi al-Ajal and surrounding terrain, faint dotted lines appeared, alignments of circular depressions marking vertical shafts of ancient foggaras. From above, these underground irrigation systems formed intricate webs extending kilometres beyond visible settlement cores. The revelation was profound. What had once been perceived as isolated oases were now understood as nodes in an expansive engineered landscape. Fields long since reclaimed by desert could be mapped through subtle soil discolorations and residual channel patterns. The scale of Garamantian agriculture far exceeded earlier estimates. Archaeologists documented hundreds of kilometres of irrigation tunnels, confirming that the Garamantes had developed one of the most extensive underground water management systems in ancient Africa. This evidence reframed the kingdom not as peripheral, but as technologically sophisticated and regionally significant. Burial landscapes also gained clarity through aerial survey. Thousands of tumuli, varying in size and form, dotted the Fezzan. Their distribution revealed settlement patterns, social hierarchy, and long-term continuity. Some cemeteries clustered near ancient villages. Others marked caravan routes or territorial boundaries. Excavations of tombs yielded insights into diet, health, and material culture. Skeletal analysis provided evidence of agricultural labour, trade connections, and occasional trauma consistent with conflict. Grave goods reflected both local craftsmanship and imported items, underscoring cultural interaction. Archaeobotanical studies identified cultivated crops, barley, wheat, dates, confirming agricultural diversity sustained by Fugara irrigation. Zooarchaeological remains showed continued reliance on livestock, including camels and cattle, linking urban life to pastoral heritage. The rediscovery of the Garamantes coincided with broader re-evaluation of Saharan history. Rather than viewing the desert as a void between civilizations, scholars began to recognize it as a dynamic zone of exchange and adaptation. The Garamantes became central to that reassessment, a case study in how environmental ingenuity enabled urbanization in extreme climates. Modern geopolitical challenges have sometimes complicated research in Libya, limiting fieldwork access. Yet even intermittent excavation seasons have continued to expand knowledge. International collaborations between Libyan archaeologists and foreign institutions have documented sites, preserved artifacts, and advanced chronological frameworks. Satellite technology continues to refine mapping of ancient infrastructure. High-resolution imagery identifies subtle elevation changes indicating collapsed shafts or buried walls. Ground-penetrating radar supplements traditional excavation methods, revealing subsurface features without extensive disturbance. Beyond academic circles, the Garamantes have gained recognition as part of North Africa's diverse heritage. Their story challenges simplistic narratives that equate civilization exclusively with river valleys or coastal empires. It demonstrates that technological innovation and social complexity can flourish in arid environments when knowledge aligns with necessity. The legacy of the Garamantes resonates in contemporary Saharan oasis communities. Elements of irrigation practice, settlement organisation, and desert navigation reflect deep historical continuity. Though direct lineage is difficult to trace conclusively, cultural memory often survives in adaptation rather than static preservation. Environmental lessons drawn from Garamantian history hold relevance today. Their reliance on fossil groundwater mirrors modern extraction from deep aquifers in arid regions. The eventual depletion that contributed to their decline underscores the importance of sustainable management. Archaeology thus becomes not only a window into the past, but a cautionary reflection for the present. Garama's ruins stand as tangible reminders of resilience. Visitors walking among mud brick foundations encounter a city once vibrant with markets, households, and caravan negotiations. The surrounding desert, though austere, no longer appears empty. It reveals faint lines of ancient engineering, testament to a civilization once underestimated. Educational initiatives and museum exhibitions increasingly highlight the Garamantes within broader narratives of African history. Their story complicates outdated stereotypes of isolation and technological stagnation. It affirms that innovation arises wherever environmental challenge demands creativity. The rediscovery process itself reflects shifts in archaeological methodology. Early excavations prioritised monumental architecture and written inscriptions. In contrast, the study of the Garamantes relied on landscape archaeology, environmental reconstruction, and interdisciplinary collaboration. The absence of grand temples or extensive inscriptions required patience and technological assistance. Each Fagara shaft mapped from satellite imagery adds to a composite picture of ambition and coordination. Each pottery fragment, dated through stratigraphy, refines chronology. Each burial excavated with care restores a fragment of individual identity within collective history. The Garamantes' legacy today lies not only in ruins, but in perspective. They illustrate that history is not confined to regions long celebrated in classical texts. Entire kingdoms can remain partially obscured until tools and curiosity converge. In the silence of the Fezzan, the rediscovery of the Garamantes transforms perception. The Sahara becomes layered rather than blank. Beneath sand lie irrigation networks that once sustained fields. Beneath gravel plains rest ancestors who anchored identity to land. Beneath brief classical references stands a civilization that bridged Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds. The lost civilization rediscovered is not merely a story of excavation. It is a story of correction, of restoring balance to historical understanding. The Garamantes were neither myth nor marginal footnote. They were engineers of water, masters of caravan routes, builders of urban space beneath an open sky. Today, as satellites orbit above the Sahara and archaeologists trace faint patterns across digital maps, the desert yields its secrets gradually. The rediscovery continues. Each season of research deepens awareness that beneath the dunes lie chapters of human ingenuity once overlooked. The Garamantes' civilization may have declined in antiquity, but through archaeology and technology it has re-emerged, not as legend, but as documented history. And in that rediscovery, the Sahara speaks again of a kingdom that thrived where few believed it could endure. The lost civilization, rediscovered. For centuries, the Garamantes existed at the edge of historical memory. Classical writers mentioned them briefly, often vaguely. The desert concealed their cities beneath drifting sand and eroded mud brick. Travellers crossing the Fezzan saw ruins, burial mounds, and scattered shafts, but without context, these remains seemed isolated, fragments without a coherent narrative. It was not until modern archaeology turned sustained attention to the Fezzan of southwestern Libya that the scale of Garamantean civilization began to emerge. And even then, understanding unfolded gradually, through excavation trenches, pottery shards, aerial surveys, and eventually satellite imagery revealing patterns invisible from the ground. At the centre of this rediscovery lay the ruins near Garama, identified with ancient Garama. Early explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries noted substantial remains in the Wadi al corridor, mud brick walls, cemetery tumuli, and traces of irrigation channels suggested organised settlement. Yet for decades, the Garamantes were dismissed as marginal desert tribes mentioned only fleetingly in Roman texts. Systematic archaeological work in the mid to late 20th century began to change that perception. Excavations uncovered structured residential compounds, defensive walls, storage facilities, and craft evidence. Pottery sequences allowed researchers to establish chronological phases of occupation stretching from the early first millennium BCE through late antiquity. Imported Mediterranean ceramics confirmed sustained trade connections. The true transformation in understanding, however, came with advances in remote sensing. Satellite imagery of the Sahara revealed networks that could not be fully appreciated from ground level. Across the Wadi al and surrounding terrain, faint dotted lines appeared, alignments of circular depressions marking vertical shafts of ancient fogaras from each. Above, these underground irrigation systems formed intricate webs extending kilometres beyond visible settlement cores. The revelation was profound. What had once been perceived as isolated oases were now understood as nodes in an expansive engineered landscape. Fields long since reclaimed by desert could be mapped through subtle soil discolorations and residual channel patterns. The scale of Garamantian agriculture far exceeded earlier estimates. Archaeologists documented hundreds of kilometres of irrigation tunnels, confirming that the Garamantes had developed one of the most extensive underground water management systems in ancient Africa. This evidence reframed the kingdom not as peripheral, but as technologically sophisticated and regionally significant. Burial landscapes also gained clarity through aerial survey. Thousands of tumuli, varying in size and form, dotted the Fezzan. Their distribution revealed settlement patterns, social hierarchy, and long-term continuity. Some cemeteries clustered near ancient villages, others marked caravan routes or territorial boundaries. Excavations of tombs yielded insights into diet, health, and material culture. Skeletal analysis provided evidence of agricultural labour, trade connections, and occasional trauma consistent with conflict. Grave goods reflected both local craftsmanship and imported items, underscoring cultural interaction. Archaeobotanical studies identified cultivated crops, barley, wheat, dates, confirming agricultural diversity sustained by Fogara irrigation. Zooarchaeological remains showed continued reliance on livestock, including camels and cattle, linking urban life to pastoral heritage. The rediscovery of the Garamantes coincided with broader re-evaluation of Saharan history. Rather than viewing the desert as a void between civilizations, scholars began to recognize it as a dynamic zone of exchange and adaptation. The Garamantes became central to that reassessment, a case study in how environmental ingenuity enabled urbanization in extreme climates. Modern geopolitical challenges have sometimes complicated research in Libya, limiting fieldwork access. Yet even intermittent excavation seasons have continued to expand knowledge. International collaborations between Libyan archaeologists and foreign institutions have documented sites, preserved artifacts, and advanced chronological frameworks. Satellite technology continues to refine mapping of ancient infrastructure. High-resolution imagery identifies subtle elevation changes indicating collapsed shafts or buried walls. Ground-penetrating radar supplements traditional excavation methods, revealing subsurface features without extensive disturbance. Beyond academic circles, the Garamantes have gained recognition as part of North Africa's diverse heritage. Their story challenges simplistic narratives that equate civilization exclusively with river valleys or coastal empires. It demonstrates that technological innovation and social complexity can flourish in arid environments when knowledge aligns with necessity. The legacy of the Garamantes resonates in contemporary Saharan oasis communities. Elements of irrigation practice, settlement organisation, and desert navigation reflect deep historical continuity. Though direct lineage is difficult to trace conclusively, cultural memory often survives in adaptation rather than static preservation. Environmental lessons drawn from Garamantian history hold relevance today. Their reliance on fossil groundwater mirrors modern extraction from deep aquifers in arid regions. The eventual depletion that contributed to their decline underscores the importance of sustainable management. Archaeology thus becomes not only a window into the past, but a cautionary reflection for the present. Garama's ruins stand as tangible reminders of resilience. Visitors walking among mud brick foundations encounter a city once vibrant with markets, households, and caravan negotiations. The surrounding desert, though austere, no longer appears empty. It reveals faint lines of ancient engineering, testament to a civilization once underestimated. Educational initiatives and museum exhibitions increasingly highlight the Garamantes within broader narratives of African history. Their story complicates outdated stereotypes of isolation and technological stagnation. It affirms that innovation arises wherever environmental challenge demands creativity. The rediscovery process itself reflects shifts in archaeological methodology. Early excavations prioritized monumental architecture and written inscriptions. In contrast, the study of the Garamantes relied on landscape archaeology, environmental reconstruction, and interdisciplinary collaboration. The absence of grand temples or extensive inscriptions required patience and technological assistance. Each Vagara shaft mapped from satellite imagery adds to a composite picture of ambition and coordination. Each pottery fragment, dated through stratigraphy, refines chronology. Each burial excavated with care restores a fragment of individual identity within collective history. The Garamantes' legacy today lies not only in ruins, but in perspective. They illustrate that history is not confined to regions long celebrated in classical texts. Entire kingdoms can remain partially obscured until tools and curiosity converge. In the silence of the Fezzan, the rediscovery of the Garamantes transforms perception. The Sahara becomes layered rather than blank. Beneath sand lie irrigation networks that once sustained fields. Beneath gravel plains rest ancestors who anchored identity to land. Beneath brief classical references stands a civilization that bridged Mediterranean and sub-Saharan worlds. The lost civilization rediscovered is not merely a story of excavation. It is a story of correction, of restoring balance to historical understanding. The Garamantes were neither myth nor marginal footnote. They were engineers of water, masters of caravan routes, builders of urban space beneath an open sky. Today, as satellites orbit above the Sahara and archaeologists trace faint patterns across digital maps, the desert yields its secrets gradually. The rediscovery continues. Each season of research deepens awareness that beneath the dunes lie chapters of human ingenuity once overlooked. The Garamantes civilization may have declined in antiquity, but through archaeology and technology, it has re-emerged, not as legend, but as documented history. And in that rediscovery, the Sahara speaks again of a kingdom that thrived where few believed it could endure. The sands of the Sahara may seem silent today, but beneath them lies the memory of a kingdom that refused to be forgotten. The Garamantes proved that civilization does not need rivers or empires to thrive, only ingenuity, resilience, and the will to endure. From underground lifelines to caravan kingdoms, their story reshapes how we see the ancient world. And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the desert, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this documentary with someone who loves forgotten history. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world right now?